Jake Reiner had believed that Christmas would be a complete homecoming. After years of busyness, distance, and silence, he was preparing for the moment of sitting together in his Brentwood home with his parents, just like in the old days. In Jake's mind, it wouldn't be a noisy or extravagant celebration, but simply a normal dinner, where all distances would finally be bridged. But it all crumbled with a single phone call on the night of December 14th. On the other end of the line, Jake heard words no son could ever prepare himself for. Rob Reiner and Michelle Singer Reiner were dead, not from an accident, not from illness, but from dozens of fatal stab wounds. The house that held so many childhood memories had become the scene of a horrific murder. And then, the name mentioned next left Jake almost unable to stand. Nick Reiner, his younger brother. That name wasn't just the suspect's identity. It represented the complete collapse of a belief that had existed for years within the Reiner family. Jake didn't cry. He didn't collapse. The feeling was like falling into an endless void, where all sounds became distorted and time lost its meaning. 3 days later, on the night of December 17th, when Nick Reiner appeared in court in another part of Los Angeles, Jake Reiner sat in the KCBS studios, a familiar space from his years as a journalist. But that night, he wasn't a news anchor. He was a son who had just lost both his parents. The studio lights shone on Jake's face, making him look thinner, his eyes sunken from sleepless nights. His dark suit clung to his tall, slightly hunched figure, as if he were accustomed to carrying the burden of unspoken things. Jake's hands were clasped tightly together on the table, his knuckles white from clenching so hard. When Jake spoke, his voice was low and slow, as if each word had to pass through a constricted throat. "I've sat here many nights," he said, "but never a night like this." Then Jake uttered a sentence that silenced the entire studio. "I warned my parents beforehand." It wasn't an accusation, nor was it a justification. It was the collapse of a belief that had lasted for years, the belief that love, tolerance, and patience would be enough to keep a family from falling apart. And from that moment, Jake Reiner began to tell his own story, not in perfect order, but in a fragmented, rough stream of memories, like a person trying to piece together their life after everything has crumbled. Jake Reiner grew up in a home filled with laughter and art stories, but he also learned something unspoken. He was the eldest, and that meant taking a back seat. From a young age, Jake was accustomed to giving in, giving up toys to Nick, giving up his room, giving up even the explanations he had the right to offer. Nick was smaller, more fragile, more vulnerable, and so the family's attention shifted toward the youngest. When Nick got angry, everyone immediately tried to soothe him. When Nick cried, the space around them seemed to freeze. Jake observed all of this from the sidelines. He learned to sit quietly in the corner, learned to calm himself, learned to remain silent so as not to complicate things further. "I'm okay," Jake would often say, not because he was truly okay, but because he understood that was what was expected of him. Few people asked that question, and Jake didn't expect an answer. His initial yielding stemmed from an older brother's affection, but over time it became a silent habit, the habit of withdrawing himself from the center of the family. Jake gradually realized that his role wasn't to be the center of attention, but to keep things from falling apart. Rob Reiner and Michelle Singer loved Nick with a love mixed with fear. They feared their son would be abandoned, feared he would stumble, feared that even a slight loosening of their grip would cause Nick to disappear. Therefore, They protected him. They tolerated him. They believed that with enough patience, all rough edges would eventually be smoothed out. Jake didn't blame his parents. He understood that. But the older he got, the more he felt he was becoming the one carrying the rest of the family. The stability, the endurance, and the unspoken things. Once Jake said to his mother, half jokingly, half seriously, "I'm used to it." Michelle smiled. She didn't realize it was a very quiet cry for help, spoken by someone accustomed to not bothering anyone. If you feel sorry for Jake as the eldest brother, please comment number 1. Those years taught Jake to observe more than to speak, to endure more than to resist. And he didn't know that this prolonged silence, this role of stabilizer, had inadvertently masked the growing signs of danger within his own family. The changes in Nick didn't come suddenly. Initially, they were subtle, almost unnoticed signs. His eyes seemed more tired than usual, hesitations for no apparent reason, nights of unannounced disappearances. Jake remembered watching his brother for a long time during those moments with an indescribable feeling, as if he were standing before a familiar face he no longer recognized. When Nick turned 15, those signs were no longer isolated. They connected into a chain that Jake couldn't deny. Addiction appeared, initially silently, then increasingly taking over. Jake understood that it wasn't a fleeting teenage rebellion. It was a cry for help. But that cry was gradually drowned out in the very chaos it created. The Reiner family began a familiar cycle. Nick spiraled downward. Then he made promises. Then he started all over again. Each time Nick returned from rehab, he would sit at the dinner table with slightly trembling hands, his voice low and slow. "This time I'll be all right," Nick would say, and Rob would nod. Michelle would take her son's hand, as if a little tighter grip would prevent everything from slipping away. Jake stood beside them, wanting to believe, but fear was beginning to creep into his heart. Not fear of Nick, but fear of that recurring hope itself. Each disappointment didn't come down violently, but slowly eroded him. What hurt Jake most wasn't just watching Nick lose control, but watching his parents wear themselves down with each passing moment. Rob aged rapidly during those years. His shoulders slumped. The silences grew longer. Michelle lived in a constant state of waiting for a call, waiting for news that Nick was still alive, waiting for a sign that her son hadn't completely fallen into darkness. Jake once heard his mother say in the kitchen, her voice trembling, "As long as he's breathing, I won't give up." There were nights Nick came home completely out of control. Jake vividly remembered his father instinctively stepping forward, standing between the two brothers like a shield. Michelle closed the door to her room, crying silently so Nick wouldn't see. The house no longer functioned as a normal family. It was more like a temporary shelter where everyone lived day by day, hour by hour, in a state of constant vigilance. "We have to save him," Rob once said. Jake didn't answer. A question echoed in his mind that he dared not voice. Who would save those who were trying to save Nick? It was during those years that Jake began to learn to observe more than to speak. He clearly sensed that his family was no longer living on pure love, but was existing in a state of prolonged survival. And somewhere deep inside, Jake began to harbor a thought he'd never allowed himself to admit: to leave. Not because he didn't love his family, but because he feared that if he stayed too long, he too would be drawn into that inescapable vortex. He feared fame. He feared his privacy being torn apart. He feared living his whole life as the silent older brother in the face of a growing tragedy unfolding in his own home. The thought wasn't clear. It simply existed quietly, like a hazy road ahead. But Jake didn't know that, whether he left or not, that tragedy was still approaching the Reiner family, slowly, patiently, and inevitably. The thought of leaving the Brentwood house didn't come to Jake as a clear decision. It formed slowly, like someone gradually realizing they no longer have enough air to breathe in what was once called home. Jake didn't tell anyone. He just began preparing for it in silence. He feared fame, not because of his family's reputation, but because of what it entailed: curiosity, untimely questions, and the feeling that every private tragedy could be exposed simply because of the Reiner surname. Jake didn't want his life to become an extension of stories he couldn't control, so he chose a different path. Jake left Los Angeles to study journalism at Syracuse University. It wasn't an act of rebellion, but more like an attempt to prove himself that he could exist on his own, without the spotlight or the shadow of his father. There, amidst the classrooms and small newsrooms, Jake found something that made him feel safe, being behind the story rather than becoming the story. "I chose journalism," Jake once said softly, "because I thought that if I told other people's stories, life wouldn't call my name." After graduating, Jake began his career slowly and steadily. He worked at local stations, from Kion in Salinas to KPRC Channel 2 in Houston. At each place, Jake was remembered as a meticulous, easy-to-work-with reporter, especially in legal and law enforcement-related news. He wasn't flashy. He didn't rely on family fame. Everything was built step by step, just like the way he always lived. The work took Jake away from his old home, from the stressful nights and heavy conversations, but each time night fell, when he took off the microphone, removed his vest, and returned to his empty apartment, a familiar feeling returned. An unnamed void, something he'd carried for a long time, only previously obscured by the silence of his family. Whether living in Houston or later returning to Los Angeles to work at KCBS-KCAL, Jake maintained a certain distance from the Reiner surname. He didn't shy away from it, but he didn't use it as a ticket either. He built his reputation on a consistent presence, on a calm voice, on regularly appearing in front of the camera as a reliable storyteller. Meanwhile, his love for baseball, the quiet legacy his father passed down, remained. Jake hosted a podcast about the Dodgers, where he could talk about his passion without having to explain who he was. Those recording sessions, filled with laughter, were among the few moments Jake felt connected to his family in a painless way. But no matter how far he went, Jake never truly left his family. Each phone ring, each message from home, each prolonged silence in their conversations reminded him that the thread had never been broken. He was just standing a little further away, observing, hoping that distance would help things calm down. Jake didn't know that, while he tried to build a life of his own, the cracks in Reiner's family were silently growing, and the path he chose to escape the tragedy, ultimately, was just a detour leading him back to the starting point, in the most painful way. Jake's return to film wasn't a declaration, nor a glamorous comeback. It came late, cautiously, as if he were always teetering on the edge between desire and apprehension. Jake didn't enter the film industry with the mindset of an heir. He came as someone who had taken a long detour, carrying the hesitation of someone afraid of the spotlight, but also unable to deny the call of the story. Jake's early roles were small, discreet, sometimes appearing in only a few scenes. He didn't try to attract attention. He immersed himself in the rhythm of the character, carrying an indescribable quietness. People began to notice something different in Jake. Not loud, not ostentatious, but persistent and quiet, like someone more accustomed to observing than being seen. Whether in front of the camera or behind the scenes, Jake often thought about his parents more than he dared admit. In the quiet moments between takes, Rob Reiner's image was vividly present in his mind, standing with his arms crossed behind the set, his eyes serious but sparkling with pride. Michelle, however, was different. She always appeared in Jake's memory more gently, as if silently capturing each moment with an invisible camera. Some evenings, Jake would call home after finishing a new role. His voice tried to remain calm, but his heart raced like a child waiting for recognition. He spoke of the auditions, of being chosen from thousands of applicants, of the small but significant steps forward. "I did it," Jake said, half-jokingly. On the other end of the line, Rob was silent for a few seconds, a familiar silence Jake had known since childhood, then simply said, "I knew it." Michelle would laugh, her voice trembling, saying that she always believed her son would find his own place. Jake kept those words as a talisman. Every small award, every humble compliment, he wanted to share with his parents first. In the years that followed, Jake gradually appeared more frequently on screen. He participated in television and film projects, from comedy to drama. 2023 marked an emotional turning point when he starred in series such as Curb Your Enthusiasm, For All Mankind, American Crime Story, and especially the lead role in the independent film Love and Tax. That role earned Jake the Best Actor award at the 2024 Myrtle Beach International Film Festival, an achievement not a huge one by Hollywood standards, but enough for him to feel he was on the right path. However, for Jake, success was never the destination. Every time he stood in front of the camera, he wasn't just acting for the director or the audience. He was acting for two people who had always watched him from afar. Deep down, Jake believed that his parents had seen him, understood those silent efforts. Therefore, a quiet belief grew within Jake. This Christmas, he would come home. After all the years away, after the silences and busyness, he would walk into the old living room, placing his accomplishments on the table like belated gifts. He imagined Rob nodding slowly, Michelle holding his hand, smiling and saying, "Our son?" That thought was enough to warm Jake's chest for many long nights. He had planned meticulously which flight, what gifts, and even the simple words he wanted to utter when he opened the door. "I'm home." Jake didn't know that this belief, the belief in a complete return, was being built just before the moment it would be utterly destroyed. Jake had thought a lot about that moment of return. He pictured himself walking into the Brentwood house as he had done many times before, but this time it was different. No rush, no avoidance. He would stay long enough to say everything he had kept inside for years. This Christmas, he believed that all distances would finally be closed. But on the night of December 14th, while Jake was in New York finishing up a film project, his phone rang. No warning, no time to prepare. Just a call, like hundreds of other calls he had received in his life. The only difference was that after that call, things were no longer the same. On the other end of the line, Jake heard disjointed, cold, and irreversible words. Rob Reiner and Michelle Reiner were gone. Not because of age, not because of illness, but because they had been stabbed dozens of times. right in the house where Jake grew up, the house he had imagined returning to in just a few days. Jake stood motionless. He didn't collapse. He didn't scream. It felt like he was falling into an infinite void, where sound was sucked away, where time stopped but the pain didn't. All his Christmas plans, all the words left unspoken, all the gifts still in his suitcase, everything became meaningless in an instant. Then the name was mentioned, Nick, his younger brother, the one Jake had protected, tolerated, and feared for years, the one he had warned his parents to be wary of. The news came like a second, deeper, colder cut, leaving Jake unable to react. He couldn't believe that two images, his younger brother from years ago and the accused of causing the tragedy, could exist in the same person. Jake didn't cry at that moment. The pain was so overwhelming that his emotions seemed to freeze. He just stood there, letting thoughts drift through his mind like fragments that could never be put back together. Christmas was no longer a time for reunion. It had become a cold, empty space where two chairs would forever remain unoccupied. Soon after, Jake flew back to Los Angeles. He met Romy. They didn't need many words. They just hugged and cried, as if that were the only way to remind themselves they were still family. Amidst the bright lights of Hollywood, a place once associated with joy and success, Jake felt utterly alone for the first time. In the hours that followed, the pain gradually transformed into something else, heavier, more intense. Old memories began to resurface, out of order, out of logic. The calls, the warnings, the times he had tried to voice his fears, and then an unstoppable thought arose, though Jake didn't want to admit it. If only they had listened to him. That thought offered no answer. It only opened a new, deeper, more festering wound that would haunt Jake for a long time afterward. 3 days after the tragedy, on the night of December 17th, Los Angeles was shrouded in a heavy silence. At one end of the city, Nick Reiner climbed the cold stone steps of the courthouse, the flashlights flashing incessantly. At the other end, Jake Reiner sat in the KCBS studio, a familiar space for him through countless long working nights. But that night, everything was different. The studio lights shone down, revealing Jake's gaunt face. He was thinner than before, his eyes sunken from lack of sleep and excessive crying. His dark suit clung to his tall but slightly hunched figure, as if his body had become accustomed to carrying unspoken burdens. Jake sat upright at the desk, but his shoulders were stiff, his hands clasped tightly together, his knuckles white. When the cameras came on, Jake was no longer the familiar news anchor. He was a son who had just lost both his parents. Jake's voice was low and slow. Each word seemed to be forced through a constricted throat. He said he'd sat at this table many nights, but never one like this. No script, no familiar professional distance, only memories and lingering pain. Then Jake uttered a sentence that nearly silenced the studio. He had warned his parents beforehand, not in anger, not in a rash argument, but from the very real fear of a son who had seen something approaching. Jake said that 3 months earlier, when he heard Nick wanted to come back to live with his parents, he panicked. Nick had been homeless for years, heavily addicted, and unable to control his behavior. Jake recounted that he called his parents, his voice urgent, begging them to be careful. He said he didn't feel safe, that Nick might do something irreparable. Those words didn't come from resentment, but from the helplessness of someone who had been afraid for too long. But his parents chose hope. Jake remembered his father's voice vividly, calm and patient as always. Rob said that Nick was their son. that the family couldn't abandon each other. Michelle reassured Jake that they would keep an eye on Nick, that they believed love could bring their son back. Jake tried to say more. He mentioned Nick's outbursts of anger. He mentioned the years his brother spent on the streets. He mentioned the darkness that addiction had sown in him. But his parents' compassion prevailed. As Jake spoke, his voice began to break, not from anger, but from belated helplessness. He said he never thought Nick could do such a thing, that he had hoped, though he feared, that things wouldn't go this far. But it happened. Jake bowed his head for a long time. When he looked up, his eyes were red. He said that anger came after the pain, intense and burning, angry at Nick, angry at himself, angry that his warnings had gone unheard. And in that anger, another feeling emerged, an unnamed guilt, the question repeating itself in his head. If only I had done more. Jake didn't answer that question. He just let it hang in the air in the studio, where the news anchor and the sun had become one. And in that moment, Jake Reiner was no longer behind the story. He was living the most painful story of his life. After Nick Reiner was taken into custody, the following days passed in Jake's indescribable state of limbo. The pain hadn't subsided. The anger hadn't fully erupted. Everything piled up like a thick fog, obscuring any escape route. Jake barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, images of his parents appeared, along with the words he had uttered, the warnings he had sent, but no one had truly listened to. Then Jake's phone rang. He looked at the screen and knew who it was, even before reading the caller ID. That name had followed him his entire life, from his childhood to this very moment. Jake held the phone for a long time, as if a single touch could drag him back into a nightmare he wasn't ready to face. Finally, he answered. On the other end, Nick's voice was hoarse, urgent, and mixed with the panic of someone who had just lost their freedom. Nick spoke incessantly, as if afraid that if he paused for even a second, Jake would hang up. He swore he was innocent, that things had spiraled out of control, that what everyone was saying wasn't the whole truth. "You're the only one I have left," Nick said, his voice breaking with despair. Jake closed his eyes. In that moment, the voice on the other end wasn't just that of a man incarcerated. It superimposed the memory of a boy Jake had protected, indulged, shielded for years. But at the same time, the image of his parents, Rob and Michelle, appeared painfully clear, like an inescapable reminder. Then Nick mentioned money, $4 million in bail. The number was spoken coldly, like a last resort. Nick begged Jake to help him, to use money, influence, anything he had left to get him out of jail. "I can't live in this," Nick said, almost in tears. "Just this once." Jake was silent for a long time. He heard his own breathing, heavy and uneven, like someone standing between two cliffs. On one side was a lifelong bond of friendship. On the other was the undeniable truth. In that silence, Jake understood that this was no longer a rational choice. This was the final boundary he had to draw, even knowing it would hurt everything that remained. "Nick," Jake finally spoke, his voice low, "I can't." 3 words spoken slowly, but heavy as stone. Jake said he couldn't use money to escape the truth. He couldn't save Nick that way. On the other end of the line, Nick yelled, angry and panicked at the same time. He accused Jake of betrayal, of abandoning him like everyone else had done. Jake clenched his fists, tears welling up. "I'm not abandoning you," he said, his voice trembling. "But I can't save you this way either." The call ended in ragged breaths and a sudden silence. Jake stared at the now-off phone screen, feeling as if he'd just severed the last thread connecting him to his brother. He didn't know if Nick believed him. He didn't know if the decision was right or wrong. Jake only knew that there are moments in life when love isn't enough to save a person, and that's the cruelest punishment of all. When the news broadcast ended on the night of December 17th, many people remained seated in front of their screens. No one rushed to stand up. No one knew what to say. The story that had just been told was unlike a typical news broadcast. It was like a door accidentally opened, revealing a pain so private, so real, that viewers felt they were standing too close to something that shouldn't be seen. On social media, responses appeared almost immediately, but there were no loud arguments, no sensational headlines, just short, fragmented comments. Some wrote that they couldn't breathe after watching it. Some confessed to turning off the TV midway, then turning it back on, because they didn't have the courage to watch further, but couldn't turn away either. Many said that, in that moment, Jake Reiner was no longer a journalist or the son of a celebrity. He was just a son. That feeling of intrusion lingered for a long time. It was as if the audience understood they had just witnessed a pain that could not be replayed, could not be edited, could not be recounted in a gentler way. And it was that very silence that allowed the story to spread. In the days that followed, Jake lived almost in a semi-conscious state. Nightmares repeated themselves, images of his parents. The sound of their warnings echoed in his head, now unheard. Jake's anger did not dissipate. It coexisted with an emptiness, burning from within, leaving an unnameable sense of guilt. 3 months, just 3 months earlier, he had said everything he could. He had seen the danger approaching. He had tried to stop it. And then he had to live the rest of his life with an unanswered question. If they had listened to him, would things have been different? From the outside, Jake Reiner's life had once looked like a clear, straight line. A famous surname, a stable career, a familiar voice on television. But when all the layers are peeled away, all that remains is a man who has lived too long in silence, who spoke a warning too late to save anyone. Jake not only lost his parents in a horrific moment, he also lost the belief that love and patience are always enough to keep a family safe. His warning, when it was no longer effective in saving his loved ones, became the only thing he could leave behind for the outside world. Jake Reiner's story isn't about seeking attention. It's a painful reminder that there are warning signs that cannot be ignored, even when they appear in the people we love most. There are boundaries that must be set, not out of a lack of love, but because we want to preserve something before it's too late. And there are Christmases that will never come again. If you're listening to these final seconds, you probably understand that this isn't just the story of a famous family. It's a very human fear that sometimes the home we believe is safest is where tragedy silently grows.